Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer lore video on the Moot, Mootland, or most formally known as the Grand County of Mootland. The region now known most commonly around the Empire as the Moot was founded in the year 1010 of the Imperial calendar. Now, the most common story around the founding of the Moot revolves around Emperor Ludwig II. Ludwig II Hockenbach, or otherwise known as Ludwig the Fat, famously anointed the halflings with their own province following a meal he'd been cooked by a halfling chef. The emperor stated it was the best meal he'd ever had, and as a reward granted the halfling people a province of their own, along with an elector count vote. Now, for those of you new to the channel who perhaps don't know, in the Empire of Man, an elector count vote is a vote given to each of the counts of the provinces within the empire, and with that elector vote, they are able to cast their vote for the next emperor. So the emperor is elected from amongst their number, and these elector votes get you to be able to have a say in who that is. Obviously, with this comes a great degree of political power. Now, most of the empire was shocked at this news, let alone the citizens of Averland and Stirland, who were promptly led away from their homes at the spear point of the emperor's men, so that the halflings could establish their own province. This, to this day, lives on as a decision of infamy and lunacy to a certain degree as well. But that's not entirely the whole story. People think that Ludwig was just won over by this simple feast. In fact, it was also Ludwig's jester, Hambelly Hazelden, who kept whispering in the emperor's ear, "Wouldn't it be hilarious if you granted a province to the halflings? Wouldn't the counts of Averland and Stirland just be so angry, and wouldn't that be such a hoot, Emperor? You should definitely do it." And following the meal from the chef and the constant whisperings in his ear from his favorite jester, Ludwig the Fat did in fact relent and agree to give them their own province and their own elector vote, which is an extra bonus for them there too. Hambelly himself in fact became the first count, but the halflings don't like to use the word count, so they prefer the term elder, because they think the word count is a little bit too posh and formal, so they use the word elder, so he became the first elder of the Moot and of the halfling people. As I stated, the Moot is located between the lands of Stirland and Averland, as you can see it here, the people of which were forced out of those provinces. So there's a lot of hostility on either side of the Moot with Stirlanders and Averlanders to this day, in fact. The Moot itself is a beautiful area, said to be the most fertile area in the Central Empire, with its gently rolling hills and patches of forest and greenery. The slopes of the Moot tend to sort of roll in a very mild upward trajectory towards the eastern part of the province, known as the Greenleaf Hills. So there's kind of an upward incline steadily throughout the province, leading in that general direction. There are said to be three major areas of the Moot, or Mootland if you prefer. The first being the Ava Marsh area, which you see here. Now, the Ava Marsh was once a very prosperous barony of Averland before the Emperor's orders and the Averlanders had to give it up and be marched out. They had a number of castles guarding its borders against potential sort of interior threats, and those castles and fortresses have since been demolished really brick by brick by the halflings who have used the stone for walls or fences or for other different creations. So a number of ruined fortresses lie along the border of the Ava Marsh. Some minor nobles in Averland still lay claim to the province and from time to time will petition the emperor to reinstate their claims, but those claims are largely ignored at this point. The Moot has been established for that long a period of time. Now, even the halfling people here tend to take on some of the traits of their Averlander cousins, or not cousins, neighbors, shall we say, and they tend to share much more in common with the Averlander culture than necessarily other parts of the Moot itself. In terms of the industries in the area, or the agriculture, it tends to be large herds of grazing land, and goats and sheep tend to be tended within the area of the Ava Marsh. Towards the north of the marsh is the town of Appel. Appel? I don't know how to say that. My best guess is Appel. Now, this is a very well-known province, particularly famous for its acres and acres of apple orchards that stretch for miles around the village itself. The village is a bit of a trading hub, or at least the closest that the Moot comes to a trading hub, with a small river port, where a number of the goods produced in the Moot are sent out to the other provinces of the Empire. It's said to be the most diverse town or village within the Moot, with a number of outsiders visiting Sour Appel, with it being conveniently located on the river and on the border of the Moot. So traders, human traders, traders from even further afield aren't necessarily a rare sight in Sour Appel, unlike the rest of the Moot. Now, the Sour Appel villagers or townspeople tend to consider themselves a little bit above their sort of country bumpkin cousins in the rest of the Moot. They put on airs, as it were, perhaps speak in a more, should we say, refined accent, or at least try to put one on. And this tends to annoy the rest of the citizens of the Moot, but it's never resorted to any aggression, maybe just some mild mockery from time to time, and Sour Appel citizens are met with much derision when they tend to visit the other parts of the Moot, and equally they will probably mock their country bumpkin cousins when they come to Sour Appel. Because of this mixture they have with the outside world, it's a well-known fact that that Sour Appel tends to be a hub of breeding halfling adventurers, shall we say. Now, halfling adventuring isn't necessarily frowned upon, but it's not exactly hailed as a great pastime for young up-and-coming halflings. And when they're often questioned about this, the citizens of Sour Appel often use the phrase, "They're only leaving to escape all the excitement going on in the town." They say it with a little bit of a wink and a nod, but, they're not necessarily as displeased as the rest of the Moot might be if a number of their citizens had decided to pick up sticks and leave the Moot and become adventurers. Now, the next region of the map we are going to look at is in the southeast. As I mentioned, it's the area where the country tends to slope uphill towards Greenleaf. Greenleaf wasn't always known as the Greenleaf area of the Moot. During the formation of the Moot, the Greenleaf area wasn't even included as part of the Emperor's set aside for what the Moot province should be. And it used to be known as the Duchy of the Fallow Hills, because the Everland Lord, who owned these lands, couldn't grow anything on them. As far as he was concerned, they were completely useless hills, and he couldn't grow any crops or make any money from it. And eventually, the Mootlanders, the halflings, made him an offer to buy the land off him. And he sold it to the halflings, thinking them slightly idiotic for buying it off him, and was known to historically iterate good riddance as he departed the lands and moved on to his next project. The halflings, rich in their knowledge of farming and the nature of the land itself, knew what kind of plants they could grow on there, and immediately started planting tobacco leaves, and they flourished, creating an entire tobacco industry throughout the region. The Greenleaf Hills actually earned their name just due to the sheer abundance of tobacco that has now grown in the area, covering all the hills in green tobacco leaf, becoming one of the wealthiest exports and industries within the Moot, and in fact within the entirety of the Empire itself. Now, when they started planting their tobacco leaves, the halflings launched a particularly aggressive marketing campaign, sending traders out to give out free samples, really trying to dominate the trade of tobacco within the Empire itself. At that time, tobacco hadn't been a huge growth within the Empire, and in fact, much of the tobacco smoked in the Empire had been imported from Bretonnia. So the halflings sent out all their traders to go and try and rustle up some business, and eventually their sort of very commonly used now phrase, but at the time was really just their sales pitch, was, "Oh, have some of our Fogmaker Red, or Ava Prime Blend, or the notoriously strong Fumigator Blend that we grow in the hills of the Green Leaf. Don't have any of that imported Bretonnia stinkweed. Have some of ours." And they took all their different brands of tobacco and sold them widely throughout the Empire, making it the powerful industry it is today. Now, the center of the tobacco industry within Greenleaf is really focused around the village of Gipfel. Now, Gipfel itself isn't a hugely built-up town. It really just consists of a few houses fairly spread out and a number of warehouses to store all the tobacco come the harvest. There's a temple to Sigmar on site, and there's a very well-known inn known as the Inn of the Free Smoke Rings, where traders and alike can stop off and rest a while they wait. The Inn of the Free Smoke Rings is owned by the largest landowner in the Greenleaf area, a gentleman known as Dagobert Halfland, or more colloquially as Old Dag. Now, Old Dag has become a very powerful halfling. His wealth is growing, I wouldn't say exponentially, but at a steady and increasing rate. He keeps buying up more tracts and tracts of land and growing more and exporting more and more tobacco. He's really becoming something of a tobacco king in the Greenleaf Hills, and has his fingers in a number of local businesses as well. Now, on the whole, the Greenleaf Hills is a fairly quiet area until the harvest comes in and the tobacco starts to be traded out and dried out, and it becomes something of a seasonal hub of commerce, really, if you like. But the town of Gipfel does hide a very dark secret. Now, Old Dag, although on the surface a friendly and amicable chap, even though he is a wealthy landowner, wasn't always living in the Moot. In fact, he spent some time up in Kislev and explored the lesser populated regions of Kislev, shall we say. Upon his return to the Moot, he managed to gather up a few friends and talk to them about a deity he'd found out about while he was traveling through the Kislev Hills. Now, he claimed it was a deity of fertility and would help them grow their crops and increase the trade of tobacco evermore on the lands they owned. And indeed, some of the secret behind Old Dag's wealth is that year after year, his crops grew in more fertile than anybody else's. He brought in more weight, he sold more, and people started to pay attention to him in this cult of fertility. Now, at the beginning days of the cult, they'd just be a few friends meeting in secret, but as it grew and as the effects of the cult began to be seen in his friends and family and the other farmers who worshipped with Old Dag, then eventually most, if not the entirety of the village of Gipfel became members of Old Dag's cult. Now you might say, what's the harm in that? They're praying to a god isn't particularly widely known or we don't know the name of, but their crops are coming in gangbusters and they're all doing very well. Well, the darker side of this is that although they do pray to this god and they do carry out secret rites, one of these secret rites is that every year at the autumn equinox, Old Dag and the village need to sacrifice a living person. At first they would just steal a halfling from out of his bed, but now it's become very much more of a let's take an outsider who's far from home, who may have been killed by umpteen things along the way and no one will necessarily come looking for them. So every night on the autumn equinox, a poor sod who just happened to be traveling through the village is abducted, brought to the middle of a tobacco field with the entire village holding pitchforks, and promptly made a human sacrifice of, and have his blood pour into the ground. That's their annual sacrifice for the year done. So Gipfel, on the surface, a lovely trading tobacco town with all the tobacco you could ever want. Just don't necessarily visit the town anytime near autumn equinox. You might find yourself in a Wicker Man situation. That about sums it up for the Greenleaf region of the Moot. Moving up to the northern part, the third region of the Moot that's famously known is Old Stirland. Now, not spelled as in Stirland the province, but you get the idea. This essentially was the part of the Moot that was part of Stirland originally. Now, Old Stirland is very much all mostly farming regions. It's known as the breadbasket of the Moot, and indeed the breadbasket for a significant portion of the provinces around the area, producing huge amounts of wheat and grain, with the odd patch of woodland around the area as well. There's not really a lot of major roads in the Moot, but there are some old carts that connect to some of the larger known roads around the empire. The province of Old Stirland, it isn't just beautiful farmland, it also contains the Altern Forest. Now, the Altern Forest, alternatively known as Alter Mutterholes, or the Old Mother Wood, is a particularly notorious forest within the Moot. It's said to be haunted by the spirits of the old ways, and those consist of blood-drinking ghosts of a long-forgotten religion that are said to stalk the woods at night. Sounds have often been heard coming out of the forest on foggy nights, and indeed, a number of people have gone missing over the years. This became such a common occurrence that the Empire even sent a hunting party into the woods at one point, led by a priest of Sigmar, and the only survivor was a horse that ran out of the woods badly injured, that so bad in fact the horse had to be euthanized, and nothing was ever heard from the hunting party again. So exactly what inhabits the woods, the hunting party had an inkling it was just a monster rather than ghosts and what have you, but what exactly inhabits the woods no one knows, but it's very much a dangerous area to go into. Now, there are two inns at either side of the wood, because it is said if you stick to the road and travel at daylight, you're most likely going to traverse the woods very safely. It's only if you get stuck in there at night that you're in trouble. Thus, the two ends on either side of the wood tend to provide a harbour for those who try to rush through and make the trip in a day or less. And those two inns are the Laughing Rabbit on one side and the Red Hart on the other. Now, it's very common practice for halflings in either of the two inns to have a running pool of who they think's going to make it through the woods on any given day. And it's something they enjoy gambling on. That's how notoriously dangerous the Altern Forest can be. So best avoid it at night, but if you do travel it in the day, travel it rapidly, and get out before the sun sets. That's the Altern Forest for you. In the center of the Moot is the Moot's capital. I'm gonna slaughter the pronunciation of this, but Eicheschatten? That's the best I can do, guys. I know my German viewers are going to be covering their ears as they're bleeding out, but I apologize. That's my best guess. And this is the capital of the Moot, built on the banks of the Ava Reach. It consists mainly of cottages and homes with extensive gardens thinly spread. It's not a city or a town really as humans recognize it. I mean, I think humans would probably classify it as a village and nothing more. But it's the most highly built up area within the Moot and has the most number of citizens in Mootland itself. There are a number of small family businesses with smiths and flower vendors and farming markets, all with probably families living above the small family-run businesses. The biggest house in the Moot is known as the Elder's Palace, but really it's no more than a 2-story wooden house with a sod roof that, if it gets overrun with grass at any point, often has a goat feasting upon it just to trim down the roof and, keep it manageable. And this is where the Elder's residence is officially. There is a throne room, which is really just a simple parlor in any kind of empire house, but it's said to be very nice and comfortable. It, in fact, claims very famously to have hosted Magnus the Pious, one of the most prestigious emperors of the empire, and he's said to have stated that he's never had a more comfortable night's sleep than the rest he had in Mootland on his way up to fight the armies of chaos in Kislev. Now, the elder of the Moot at the moment is a woman called Esme. Now, she happens to be a widower, and she's been the Moot elder for the last 10 years. But because she's a widower, she feels that the official elder's residence is a little bit too large for her, so she spends most of her time on her farm, slightly outside the capital itself. Now, she claims to, on her own farm, really get much more work done, and is famously quoted as saying, you can get work done and you get your own outhouse. So there we go, there's an added bonus of living in your own house, not necessarily in the Elder's Palace. I say palace in quotation marks. Now, in terms of how the capital is run, the Elder of the Moot is essentially elected every 3 years. There's a meeting every 3 years where every halfling in existence, doesn't necessarily even have to be a resident of the Moot, but every halfling within the empire or any halfling around can come along to this general meeting and vote on the next elder. Now, the elder is up for re-election every 3 years. His mate happens to have won her position for the last 10. This is also the center of justice for the halfling people. If a crime's been committed that can't be handled locally, it gets referred to the general meeting where murderers and things are judged. The halfling court system could be argued to be a little bit forgiving, shall we say? Whereas a murder anywhere else in the Empire would be greeted with a hanging. If you're found guilty of murder within the Moot, you're simply banished from the Moot itself. And I think that goes towards the idea that the halflings themselves see the Moot as such a haven and such a paradise for their own people, that being banished from the Moot is almost as bad as death itself if you can never return. So I think that's kind of the thinking behind why they think that's an equal punishment to necessarily hanging a murderer. But that's the capital, as I said. Denser gathering of houses than you'll probably find anywhere else in Mootland, but even their most prized palace is just a 2-story wooden house with a sod roof, which a goat is often found eating grass upon. So there you go. They're an unassuming people who live in a very nice, fertile, and easygoing land. Except for the human sacrifice parts, that they're a bit dodgy. Avoid those. But other than that, almost a paradise in the Empire, and a rare thing in the sort of grim, dark world of Warhammer. And obviously, very reminiscent of the Shire, a la Tolkien. But you guys would have put that one together already, I'm sure. Now, in terms of the people of the Moot, as I've mentioned, the Moot is mostly populated by halflings. Now, the origins of halflings themselves in the Warhammer world is fairly mysterious. No one's really sure where they came from. Some of the earliest dwarf histories speak of a a race of beardless manlings that were first thought to be children by the dwarves, but these were traveling with the humans as far back as the dwarves had ever really encountered humans at all. So they were coming over the World Edge Mountains with the first humans who did that at the same time. So halflings have always been about. Some claim that the halflings are an experiment by the goddess Verena. Now, Verena in the Warhammer world is essentially the Athena. She's goddess of wisdom, goddess of justice, has an owl she carts around with her. So you think of Athena, you've pretty much got the general idea. Others claim they're a creation of Ranald. Now, Ranald is kind of the Loki figure of the Warhammer world, the trickster god, the god of night prowlers, the god of thieves, that kind of thing, the god of luck as well. And they said Ranald, who's actually mentioned in Total War Warhammer, you'll often see his name pop up if you roll the dice on the Winds of Magic, and it says Ranald is pleased or whatever when your number goes up rather than down on the Winds of Magic counter. So they've been mentioning Ranald for a little while. It's a nice little touch from Creative Assembly to include Ranald in the game already. But they say Ranald created the halflings really just as a joke, as a bit of a hoot, as a bit of a laugh, to see what they'd get up to, see if they could even survive in the Warhammer world. And that's another popular theory. Halflings themselves don't ponder much on their origins. They simply say, we are as we've always been, and we like being it quite a bit. So they're just happily sort of nonchalant about their origins. They don't tend to mind or really put much thought as to why they differ from humans. But essentially, throughout the history of man, they've known to follow wherever man has been throughout the world, from Nippon to the Empire. There have been halflings along for the ride and living beside them. As I mentioned before when I was talking about sour Appel, halflings in the Moot are rarely visited by outsiders that much. This has to do with the fact that halflings themselves can be a little bit difficult to deal with. They can, to outsiders, be a sly and secretive people with a lot of theft going on. There's a lot of the idea of if you go into the Moot, halflings are going to try and rip you off at every occasion. Much like maybe being a tourist abroad. They sort of see an easy mark and look to take advantage at every opportunity. There's also this sort of derision and mockery of humans that goes on, or whoever's visiting, and very much a clannishness amongst the halflings themselves. They like to keep to their own people. They don't necessarily like strangers too much, at least when they're visiting their homeland. On the outside, they can appear friendly and nice, but there is that sort of undertone of aloofness and suspicion that the halflings often have, which tends to keep outsiders away and not have them visit too often. And this level of suspicion can even extend to other halflings. So if halflings go adventuring, or if halflings just leave the Moot for an extended period of time, they're welcomed back, but it may not be the warmest welcome one could imagine for an absent friend of many years. It's more of a, oh, you're back in town. I see. Well, that's great, I guess. That kind of a welcome, not a, let's burn them at the stake, who the hell is this person coming back from so many years abroad? But, not the warmest. Now, outside of the Moot, halflings are largely considered to be either cooks or thieves. This really comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of halfling nature. Now, the two traits that inspired the thievery and the sneakishness really comes from the fact that within halfling society, because halflings come from huge extended families and they're all always in contact, their ideas of property and ownership are very different from necessarily the humans of the rest of the empire. So within the Moot, why would you ask your auntie to borrow something? You just borrow it. It's all family, or if you're not genetically related to someone, you're more than likely related to them through marriage. So everyone in the Moot is kind of like live and let live and just sort of borrow stuff constantly from one another. And it's not really regarded as theft or taking something that that belongs to somebody. It's sort of who has use for it at the moment, and they sort of take it off, and that's very much understanded and a given within the Moot itself. The other trait of them being good cooks is true, but that's simply because halflings seem to have a gift of making a great meal out of almost any old ingredients they're given. They have a great sense for taste and flavor and can really cobble something together, and played a significant part in them getting a province in the first place. Now, coupled with this sort of external perception of them just being good for servants or thieves, there is also the underlying bitterness of the people of Averland and Stirland, which never really went away after the Emperor, Ludwig the Fat, took away their lands and their provinces. Throughout the history, particularly in the early days of the Moot's formation, this very hostile attitude towards the halflings. The halflings did not always stick to themselves in the Moot. As I've mentioned, the halflings do often go out, but that's sort of on an individual basis. They go out on adventure. But in the early days of the formation of the Moot, the halflings were a much more adventurous and politically aggressive people. With the new power that an elector vote granted them, they started to use their political weight to really insert themselves into the running and the bureaucracy of the empire. And this was very much a conscious decision of themselves. They wanted to be able to protect their own people by gaining influence within the empire itself. So they would have members of halflings running bureaucracies as Altdorf and Nullen, depending on where the capital was at the time. And they really started to become integral parts of the empire's functionality. And they had a gift for bureaucracy and the gift for working the system and a gift for politics and chatter to a certain degree as well. They started to really have an effect on the way the empire was being run in a positive way, and not just for selfishly looking out for the Moot, but for the betterment of the empire as a whole, and began to become ever more, I wouldn't say indispensable, but ever more present within the empire and not so isolated in the Moot. And this went on for some 300 odd years, from the founding of the province of the Moot in 1010 all the way until around the year 1359 of the imperial calendar. At this point, the empire needed a new emperor, and the emperor elected was the once Count of Stirland. Now, Stirland still had a lot of animosity towards the halflings and regarded them in less than kind terms due to Ludwig's decision to give away a significant portion of Stirland land to the halflings for them to run for themselves. And so the Emperor of Stirland began not necessarily a cull, but an encouragement of discrimination against halflings. If halflings in any of the human cities were called a city watch, the city watch wouldn't respond to their calls and said halflings can sort it out for themselves. Halfling neighborhoods and streets weren't maintained. Halflings were generally just discriminated against on a very aggressive level, and at times this did become extremely violent and spill over. There's tales of halflings being stoned in the street being a common occurrence towards the early time of this emperor's rule. There was even halflings having to barricade themselves in houses and fight off mobs of riotous people trying to kill them. There's a famous incident in Nullen called the Battle of the Blancmange, where the halflings were trying to fight off a mob and had run out of ammunition and started to have to throw desserts out the window at people, which is a hilarious name for a horrifying incident. So this just got increasingly worse for halflings, and this is when halflings decided that the savagery of man can't really be dealt with, can't be tamed, can't be taught not to frighten them, not to attack something other than themselves. So this is when the people who are thinking along the lines of we need to keep to ourselves, let's retreat in the Moot, became much more prevalent within halfling society. And so halflings as a whole, and it really has implications on their culture to this day, tend to stick to themselves and be very wary of man for the most part, because they know man can be savage and can be very violent at times, but they need to cooperate with man for their own protection. They can't fight off wars by themselves. They need humans to join with them, or at least help them to protect themselves. And it wasn't really, and this went on, and due to this persecution, halflings started to sort of try and fight against it, but were often met with violence and more persecution. And they started to form societies where they could trade and be safe and provide sanctuary. And initially, these societies were very much underground. Sort of like just trying to move, if halflings ever got in trouble, it would try and protect them. It would try and move them out of cities where they maybe couldn't get out by themselves. They were being persecuted. They were maybe living in ghettos. And the most famous of these was the Queensberry Lodge. And the Queensberry Lodge used to try and help halflings however it could, start trading associations with halflings, try and just make life better for halflings in general. And around the founding of things like the Queensberry Lodge, it was very much an underground thing. The Queensberry Lodge was named after one of the halfling gods, the god of ancestry and tradition. So that's where the Queensberry Lodge got its name. And they started to essentially run an underground for halfling people and try to protect them. It wasn't really until Gorbad's War, which I've mentioned in my Missing Legendary Lords Greenskin edition, hit the Empire in around the year 1707 and completely ransacked Nullen and pillaged it and destroyed the town, that the halflings in Nullen, which was the imperial capital at the time, I believe, I'm not 100% sure on that, if I remember that correctly, but, or if not the capital, a very significant city within the empire. And the halflings were very famous for helping rebuild in that effort. And this is when attitudes started to change slightly towards the halflings, and the prejudicial nature of humans over the halflings began to die out a little bit. And now in the Empire, it's just kind of considered unfashionable to be prejudiced against halflings because they're relatively harmless. But the halflings still can regard humans with that air of suspicion. And so this is why it's much less prevalent to have halflings outside of the Moot than it perhaps once was a few centuries ago. And persecution of the halflings can still be seen today, although it is increasingly unfashionable. One famous example being the savage way in which Marius Lightdorf, the elector count of Averland, struck down the halfling, rebellion, but not quite a full-blown rebellion, of 2502, one that caused Lightdorf to be chastised by the emperor himself. But he didn't really face serious repercussions for his actions and the savage way in which he slaughtered many a halfling that day. In terms of their religions, the halflings do often celebrate Sigmar, knowing him as the great protector. Although in the tale of Sigmar and all the histories of Sigmar, halflings are never once mentioned, and there's no incident of Sigmar ever coming to their aid at any point during the tales of Sigmar, so why they particularly know him as this is anyone's guess. No one's really sure. The halflings do celebrate a number of the other human gods, but they also have their own gods. They have Queensberry, who I mentioned, is the god of ancestry and tradition. They also have Esmeralda, who's the goddess of hearth and home. Josias, the farmer god. And they have Phineas, the god of tobacco. Just to name a few. There are a number of other halfling gods that they have, but those are some that are often prayed to in the Moot and worshipped openly by the halfling people. Although the religious devotion of halflings is much less than those of the people of the Empire, or really of almost any of the other old world races. They just tend to, there's a god, but they don't need to go to church every Sunday or anything like that. The halflings are kind of laissez-faire about their whole worship of deities. It's like, okay, if I need a harvest, I'll give a shout out to Josias, but, I'm not going to do it every day. That would just be excessive. So that's kind of religion within the Empire. In terms of their holidays, they tend to celebrate equinoxes, so they like the winter, autumn, spring, summer equinoxes. They celebrate them, and really, the halflings don't need much of an excuse for a party. Just to break up the quiet life of Moot living, they tend to just have a party, grab a few ales whenever they can. Their largest celebration of the year, however, their grand celebration, is Pie Week. And Pie Week's met with a whole bunch of dancing around bonfires or poles or foot races, not horse races, because they're quite short on horses in the Moot. Prize of the race is often just a lock of hair from the prettiest woman at the festival, often crowned the queen of the festival, and the winner of the race, the swiftest halfling around, gets a lock of her hair to keep forever, which is a little bit creeps, but, hey, there you go. They like to have a bit of a dance around, a bit of a drink. The sexes tend to be mostly segregated at these parties, though, however, bear in mind. But, everyone's trying to show off for the other, try and show off in front of the girls. Imagine it's more of what they'd know in America as, I guess, a middle school dance. Where, everyone's trying to impress each other and have a bit of a kiss and a cuddle. But, they're not going to stand on the same side of the room. That's preposterous. What are you trying to insinuate? So I imagine it's that kind of situation. One of the most famous sites to have your annual Pie Week is, in fact, in the town I mentioned earlier of Appel. Now, the celebration of Pie Week in Appel is a little bit special because they do a couple of things that you won't find anywhere else in the Moot. Such as, they play the notorious game of Kiss Scrump, which is said to have resulted in many children not necessarily bearing the visage of their fathers, as it's put. So Kiss Scrump, I'm guessing it's like tag, but with kissing, and one thing leads to another, once you've had a few ales in you. And they also have a tradition of dressing up in costumes that frighten them. So costumes of things that frighten them. And of course, you see costumes of beastmen and orcs, but you also see costumes of humans. Humans aren't sort of left off that list. And often in these costumes, it takes two to be in a costume, and as I mentioned earlier, it's not uncommon for the Pie Week in Apple to lead to many children being born that don't necessarily bear the resemblance to their fathers. So there we go, that must be a horrible thing to see a human costume arriving around with two halflings having a whale of a time in it, but I'm sure it's all part of the celebrations. So Pie Week's their big party every week. They have a great, not every week, every year. They have a great time. Now, moving on to the martial abilities of the Moot and the halflings. Now, the idea of a fighting halfling will lead some in the Empire to burst out into hysterics, but the halflings have been known to march to war from time to time. They have been known to send out scouts, and they're particularly good at sneaking around and scouting out areas for Imperial forces. There is, of course, the infamous artillery piece, the Halfling Hot Pot, which I really hope does make an entrance into Total War Warhammer at some point. And the Halflings themselves were a unit that was selectable as part of the Empire Army in the earlier editions of Total War Warhammer. You could equip them with spears, with one-handed weapons, with shields, with light armor. They had a bit of versatility to them. They weren't the best troops in the world, but then again, they didn't cost very much. So I'd maybe like to see these guys introduced into Total War Warhammer as that. Not necessarily have an army of halflings, that'd be ludicrous, but if you take the Moot, much like if you take Talabacland, you get the recruitment of the Knights of the Blazing Sun. I want you to be able to take the Moot and be able to get halfling units. Halfling bowmen, halfling infantry, and the hot pot. I want you to be able to recruit all of them from the Moot. And I'd like the Moot to be expanded at least to sort of 2 towns, maybe the capital, which I'm not going to try and pronounce again because I butchered it last time round, but the capital and maybe Sauerhafen as well. Don't make them a capital as in a 5-tier building, because obviously the Moot has no fortifications, but just expand the Moot, make it slightly bigger region and take it out of being part of, I think it's Stirland at the moment. It shouldn't be Stirland's second city. That's nonsense. The Moot should be its own province, and I really look forward to seeing it as such at some point in the near future. And it'd be hilarious if the Moot could only recruit its own armies at the beginning of Total War Warhammer. It wouldn't take you long to conquer them, but it would still be hilarious to see. I imagine if Creative Assembly are ever going to implement halflings into Total War Warhammer, it will probably be in a double package with snotlings. So I think you'll get snotlings, you'll get halflings, you'll get halfling bowmen at the very least, if not halfling infantry, and you would definitely get the hot pot because it's such an iconic unit in Warhammer that Total War have got to include it in there as well. So you get that, you'd probably get the snotlings and the snotling pump wagon. So I think you'd get that mixture, and I think it'd be a fantastic thing to see on Total War Warhammer, halflings and snotlings going at it with each other. Well, not going at it, you know what I mean. Fighting along with the rest of the human forces. And maybe add the scouts of the halflings, maybe give them something that... Because the huntsmen should be introduced to Total War Warhammer as well, so there should be bowmen in there, but... You know, I think you could differentiate the halflings from the bowmen of the Empire really sufficiently, like slow them down, but maybe make their stealth and stalk ability a little bit better. Maybe even give them snipe, which is, I think, the shooting while hidden. That'd be a great little thing for the halflings to have. But that's just me going off the top of my head. I think we will see, because it is very much like the cute and weird units, the snotlings and the halflings. I think they'll probably be introduced in the same DLC if they're introduced at all. Now, of the martial prowess of the, well, prowess, perhaps a generously used term, of the halflings, there has been one unit of halflings that have gone on to win infamy in some regions of the old world, and that is Lumpin Croop's Fighting Cocks. Now, although Lumpkin and his Fighting Cocks are regarded with some reverence outside of the Moot for some of their deeds in battle, within the Moot, because they are warriors, they're regarded with a little bit of disdain, regarded as somewhat of rotten apples within the people of the Moot, the peace-loving halflings of the Moot, sort of look down upon Lumpkin and his cohorts and their activities. But Lumpkin himself was born in the north part of the Moot, in a backwater village, and regarded as really being born on the wrong side of the river. His mother was a blacksmith's daughter, and his father was a fairly roguish character who's described as being a carrot salesman, which I can only imagine is a euphemism for something. His father himself was said to have died before Lumpkin was born, having choked on a horse's shoe. Now, considering his mother's father was a blacksmith, I have to imagine that's insinuating that his grandfather murdered the hell out of his father who had impregnated his daughter. So, growing up without a father at this point, Lumpkin's grandparents always resented him. He'd taken on the ginger hair of his father, which was a constant reminder to the terrible choice their daughter had made to have a liaison with the man. And this disapproval and constant scorn often drove his mother to drink, and she took up the habit on a regular basis. Lumpkin's childhood was unhappy, to say the least, with his grandfather giving him increasingly demeaning and mind-numbing chores to do, and his mother just drinking herself slowly to death. Suffice it to say that as soon as he was of age, Lumpkin ran away from home and soon was living the life of a pickpocket and a conman, doubtless skills he'd probably picked up on his father's side of the family. As time went on, Lumpkin developed these skills to become a poacher of some repute. He'd managed to evade some of the best gameskeeper within the estates of the Empire and the Moot itself, and was really having a fairly successful career, selling on his poached goods to taverns and inns in the area he was living. One of these inns was called the Old Pig and Bucket, and upon one night entering the Old Pig and Bucket to sell his goods of the evening, Lumpkin was greeted with the unwelcome sight of a group of gameskeeper, many of whom he'd recognized from his previous endeavors, all having gathered together to presumably beat the living daylights out of him. Being the quick-minded halfling that he was, Lumpkin quickly began to spin a yarn, a tale of daring, adventure, and travel, where he had to poach all those chickens and things just to afford to travel to Tilia, where a great adventure and treasure awaited him. And in fact, he'd won the crowd over. Instead of wanting to beat him near to death, the gameskeepers had been so enthralled and enamored by his story of venture and potential fortune that they all agreed to join him on his quest to Tilia, which he said he was going on. Now, Lumpkin, having no intention of going on a quest to Tilia, had to play along for the moment, and off they set that very night with his new band of fighting cocks, as they would later be known. Now, Lumpkin, still trying to escape from this lie he told, is constantly trying to slip away from these gameskeepers he's managed to pull by his side. So he's constantly trying to sneak off in the night, trying to avoid them, trying to lose them in thick woodland, but they think of him as training them. They think of it all as training exercise whenever he slips away, and without exception, they track him down and find him again, so he just can't escape them. Whenever they look at a map and he seems to be pointing them in the wrong direction, and they can tell from the direction of the sun or the lay of the land that they're going in the wrong direction and not headed in the direction of Tilia, they correct him, thinking all he's doing is trying to test their initiative and make sure they know where they're going, not necessarily he knows where they're going. So Lumpkin is just caught in this series of unfortunate events that have just led to him going to war when he didn't intend to at all. And by almost sheer accident, all this training and initiative test seems to be working. He has somehow managed to recruit and train some of the finest huntsmen and stalkers within the old world itself. He particularly cemented his reputation in a battle where he saved an entire army from slaughter. A band of greenskins had marched north from the Badlands and were attacking a province of Tilia. Lumpkin, having taken the job, was trying to sneak off the battlefield and retreat, but little did he know he'd actually bumped into a significantly sized flanking portion of the enemy army that had intended to go round and attack the enemy from the rear. Now, seeing potential easy prey in these halflings, they didn't hesitate to attack. But, being the skilled bowmen and fighters that they'd come to be through sort of hunting and stalking through the entire empire on their way to Tilia, they managed to fight off this greenskin contingent and really save an entire Tilian army from slaughter. From this day on, the job offers started to pour in for Lumpkin and the Fighting Cocks, and they've earned a sterling reputation as some of the best scouts you can find since. And there are a number of situations where this story has slightly repeated itself, with Lumpkin running into bandits accidentally on his way to try to avoid taking another job in another war zone, and them attacking the halflings because they're only halflings having to defend themselves and win yet again. And it's really just led to Lumpkin being beside himself with not grief but anxiety. He just can't get away from these guys, can't get away from war, and that's the situation he finds himself in. And eventually, after all this time doing all these jobs and having all these successful missions, the stories of adventure and treasure and banquets have become true to all his men, and all his men would happily lay down their lives for Lumpkin, despite the fact he's still just trying to escape and go back to the Moot. In fact, the battle cry for Lumpkin and his Fighting Cocks has come to be, "Hooray, hooray, the Moot, the Moot." And this took place because in the middle of a battle one day, they misheard what Lumpkin was trying to scream over the din of noise and clashing metal. What he was actually trying to shout out was, run away, to the Moot, to the Moot." But they misheard him and thought he was giving them an inspirational battle cry, and went on and won that day as well. So Lumpkin, the accidental mercenary, as perhaps we could call him, has really earned and solidified the reputation for halflings as potential scouts and valid companions in an army. And I really hope one day we don't see the halflings as a buildable unit. We'll at least get Lumpkin and the Fighting Cocks as a regiment of renown. I think it'd be great to see them on the battle. Perhaps maybe with a lower than average leadership or something like that. It would be quite good to see them. And that about sums it up, guys, for the Moot and the lore therein. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Do subscribe for more videos of this and some gameplay from Total War Warhammer. And thanks very much for watching, guys. As I say, do leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and do join me for the next one. Thanks again, and have a great day.